Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Rachel and I am knitting. Not right now, but most of the time, and I'm about to be knitting, so I thought it would be fun to take you along for the ride. If you've been a subscriber of this channel for a while, you may remember a long time ago in January of 2024, which is almost 2 years ago at this point, which is nuts. I had every intention to make a new series going over the cost of handmade, specifically hand knit items. I made a video going over the cost of a hand knit Christmas stocking, and a few months later, maybe several months later, I don't remember, I made a video going over the cost of a hand knit rat. Of course, two items, a stocking and a rat, that are in very high demand, that are on everyone's needles. A very common hand knit item, right? Not really. But anyway, I wanted to make that a series. I wanted to have maybe like monthly installments. I wanted to go over how much it would be to knit a hat, a scarf, a sweater, all the things. And then life got to lifing. I got really busy and that kind of fell by the wayside. But I'm really excited to revamp this series because I'm starting again. That's right, folks. I'm going to time myself knitting my next item I'm about to cast on, which I'll take you with me for. I'm going to calculate the yardage I use so I can determine how much it would cost equitably for me to charge a commission of this piece. Now, what is the piece, you may ask? You probably already know based on the video title and the video thumbnail, but it's going to be a Sophie scarf. Hey everybody, editing Rachel here. I just want to give a quick caveat before we really dive in and tell you that according to the Sophie scarf pattern, PetiteKnit does not want you to sell any work made from the instructions from that pattern. I've heard that things like that are not enforceable. I am not the be-all end-all authority on that, so I will just say that PetiteKnit does say do not sell items made from this pattern, so therefore this video is just a hypothetical in case you may want to think about the idea of possibly, but not ever really, selling a Sophie scarf. I've been making a lot of Sophie scarves lately, and I figured this is the perfect opportunity to have my next installment of how much does hand knit cost. I've been stash diving to find really fun combinations of yarn to marl into these Sophie scarves. This is one that I made this week with a skein of Bat Free Layer from Treehouse Knits and a skein of Lilacs at Midnight from Ruby and Roses. So beautiful. And then this, which I just cast off earlier this morning, is made with a skein of Meg from Skein and the Stitch and a gray skein of the same base that was part of an Oopsie set. They were both part of an Oopsie set, but the Meg skein, which is the variegated, is the only one that had a label. Anyway, all this to say, since I wound two 100-gram skeins up together into a giant cake, I've made one Sophie scarf and I have yarn for another. So I'm going to take you along for the ride. And yeah, I guess you might want to know what these two skeins look like separately. So here's what they look like. You can see Meg and then the gray tonal. And then when they're paired together, it makes this really beautiful, subtle marl, like a low intensity variegated skein. So pretty. So that's what we're going to do today. The Sophie scarf is a pattern by PetiteKnit, and it's a really quick gift knit. I'll tell you, by the way, since I've mentioned it's a gift knit, these are all going into my pile of gifts. So I'm not actually charging for the Sophie scarf that we'll make together, but I am curious if I ever did take a commission for a Sophie scarf, what would be the appropriate pricing. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm using size 4, US size 4 or 3.5 millimeter needles, just like the pattern calls for. I anticipate that this will take about 8 hours because when I made this one, I got halfway through about 4 hours in. I didn't time it at all. I just knew from cake winding to halfway point, it was 4 hours. So we'll see how long it takes for this. I'll start my stopwatch and we'll get going. Okay, 2.5 minutes in, and I've got my little nub. I'm to the point where I don't need to look at the pattern anymore until it's time for decreases. So I'm gonna move to a more comfortable spot. It's usually at this point when I'm like, can I just start decreasing now? This would make a really nice Sophie shawl for a Barbie. But I don't really play with Barbies anymore, so I don't think any of my nieces or nephews have Barbies. Maybe they do. But anyway, I'm gonna stay the course and continue making this an adult size Sophie scarf. Onward! One thing that really burns my butt up about this pattern is that the increases are part of the I-cord edge on one side, which the first time I made this pattern, I accidentally modified it so that the increase was not part of the I-cord. But ever since then, I've just knit according to pattern. I mean, mostly. Like in the ones that I recently finished, I modified them to have more stitches. So ultimately oh crap, this is an increase row. Ooh. I'm gonna keep the clock going because that's just a hazard of the job. You're gonna mess up. And anyway, but this is actually apt that this just happened. Okay, I've added my increase. Because the increase is basically embedded in the I-cord, it's sometimes difficult to keep track of the fact that you're on your increase row or your decrease row, depending on where you are in the pattern. So yeah, that's annoying. Now I could put my row counter marker closer to the I-cord that has the increase or decrease when I get to that point in the pattern. But since the increase is embedded in the I-cord, every time I increase, the marker will just be moved further away. Does that make sense? Like, I can't just put the marker after the first 3 stitches, which are the I-cord edge, because whenever I increase, I need to increase on that 3rd I-cord stitch. So it just keeps making the marker offset. So that's one of my gripes about this pattern. I made a jaunty shawl in October while I was in Ireland, and I really, really appreciated that Andrea Mowry does not do that with her increases and decreases. It's just to the side of the I-cord. It's not part of the I-cord. So if I wanted to pivot for the Sophie shawl or Sophie scarf in this case, there's a few things I could do. I could cast on an extra stitch. So the stitch for the increase to live is already created. I don't have to do the first increase in the I-cord at all. Or I could just do what I did the first time and start the increases in the wrong spot. Anyway, that's something that bothers me. On another note, I just mentioned that the last few Sophie scarves I've made, I have had, I added more stitches, so it made a longer and wider end product. I'm not going to do that on this one. I'm just going to knit according to pattern. I'm going to end up with the same amount of stitches that are called for in the pattern. I'm going to do the larger size just because I don't know if my neck is like triple the circumference of other necks, but if I make the small size, it simply is not going to be a look. And ultimately, this Sophie scarf is not for my neck. It's going in my gift pile, but I don't know. I just feel like bigger is better in this instance. I'm on an increase again. Almost missed it. So I will be making the bigger size, but I'm not going to go bigger than the bigger size like I have on the Sophie Scarves of recent past, just because I don't want to mess up the data. I want to know how much it cost to knit according to pattern, not with these extra frillies I've been adding. Anyway, I think I'm going to move to the living room because our Christmas tree is set up and I just feel like being a little bit more festive. And the craft room doesn't really have any Christmas decor per se. So let me finish this row. Done, and we'll head somewhere more festive. Darby's already ready to go. I'm coming. Yes, hello. This is Darby. Yes. What do you need? Do you need to go outside? Oh, okay, we found the ticket. So let's take her outside and go somewhere more festive. Much better. So I'm ready to get settled in. I'm going to sit in my Flexi Spot Lotus recliner chair that I love so much. I've got my ivy pole with my yarn hanging from it, and we'll get back to knitting. Okay, I am officially an hour in, an hour and 7, almost 8 seconds in, and this is how much I was able to knit in an hour. So, anyway, I don't know if that exceeds or defies expectations in a good way, or if I am lacking here, but either way, that's how much I knit in the first hour. Let's keep going into hour 2. Actually, really quickly before I get back to knitting, I was watching a Laura Penrose video today, and she was talking about how she doesn't use a beginning of round marker all the time and avoids it when she can, because the motion of sliding the beginning of round marker each time adds up and takes up a lot of time. So I'm curious, because I definitely am fighting and fiddling with my row counter, just because it's like so many switchbacks. So I'm wondering if maybe in the future, if I went back to my old practice of having my little clicker necklace that I used to use instead of this chain row counter, if that might make me more efficient. I don't know, but something I've been thinking about in this last hour, because I've definitely been having to fiddle around with this. But anyway, I'm going to go back to knitting, and I will update you when I am to hour 2. So once I'm 2 hours in, I'll show you my progress. Sear this into your mind and your memory. This is how much I have for hour 1. I'll be right back and show you hour 2's progress. Okay, we are 2 hours in, or really as close to 2 hours as we're gonna get, because I just finished a row and I didn't want to stop mid-row for this update. And I knew it would take me more than 6 seconds to knit a row, but this is 2 hours in and I'm over halfway through. I have reached the stitch count listed in the pattern for the larger size. And now I am just a few rows away from my first decrease. So I have a few thoughts. First of all, you may remember at the beginning of the video, I predicted that this would be about 8 hours because when I made my last Sophie scarf over the last 3 days, it took me 4 hours to knit the first half. But there's a few factors I think that contributed to that versus the 2 hours for this first half. Number one, I was making a bigger size. I was doing 7 extra sets of increases and 7 extra sets of decreases, which it equals over 100 rows altogether added onto the Sophie scarf I worked previously. The second thing is I wasn't timing myself. I wasn't conscious of time. I didn't pause. Well, I mean, I wasn't timing myself in the first place, but for this knitting experience, I'm pausing the timer every time I move the camera. Sorry to peel the veil back, peel the curtain back, break that fourth wall. But every time I move the camera and reposition to give you a new angle, I pause the timer. Every time I look at my phone to check a text message, I pause the timer. When I get up to use the restroom, I pause the timer. Whereas the last one, I wasn't conscious of time. I wasn't timing myself. I probably picked up my phone and had a few doom scrolling sessions. I was watching football with DJ at the time, so I probably stopped and had conversations with DJ. So I think all of those things together contributed to my last Sophie scarf taking longer and this one being more efficient. So 2 hours in and we're over the halfway point. So we'll keep going and I'll see you back here for hour 3. Hi, scene change. It's the next day and I just hit the 3-hour mark on my Sophie scarf. So here's my progress. Let me show you. When I left you at about 2 hours, just before 2 hours, I was just getting ready a few rows away from my first decrease, and here's how much I've done since. Now, in terms of the project as a whole, I'm just about sort of kind of 3/4 of the way through. I have this amount left to knit, and this pattern, I kind of had it in my head before that once I get to the decreases, it's all downhill from there, but I don't think that's actually true. I think that the knitting of the increases to get the first half of the scarf done goes by really, really quickly. But when I'm on the decrease section, and even though the rows are getting shorter and shorter, it just seems like this part of the process goes by so much slower. But anyway, this is 3 hours of work. I'm really curious if I can get this finished in 4 hours, because that will basically be half the time that it took me to knit my previous Sophie scarf with this same yarn. Again, like I've gone over with you, that Sophie scarf is much larger. I showed it on my podcast that I recorded yesterday, but I don't think I've shown it in this video. So let me grab the Sophie scarf I recently finished and I'll show you a comparison. So here's that previous Sophie scarf, and I knit more increases and decreases. I went up to 40 stitches on this Sophie scarf. So when I fold it in half and I have the point at the top, at the center, so this is the halfway point, you can see the difference in size. This one is considerably larger. So there are lots of extra sets of increases and decreases on this one, whereas this one, I'm just knitting according to pattern. So it's going quite faster than this one. This took me about 4 hours. I think, as I've said multiple times by now, 4 hours to get to the halfway point. This one was about 2 hours to get to the halfway point. So yeah, it would be really cool if I could finish this in 4 hours. So let's see if I can make it happen, and I'll see you back here either way in 1 hour. I'm done, and I did it in under 4 hours. Amazing. I think that when I calculate the time I spent, I'm just going to round up to 4 hours because it's so close. And also, ultimately, it will take longer than 4 hours when I account for the blocking process, but I'm not going to time that because it's really low effort. So I'm just going to call it good with 4 hours. And I'm very happy with this finished item. And I am a little surprised that I made it in under 4 hours. Very happy and impressed with that. So the next thing that I need to do is figure out how much it weighs, calculate the cost based on time and based on yardage. So I'll do that later today, and I'll see you back here when I've crunched all those numbers. Okay, hey everybody, it's actually the next day. Time got a little bit away from me yesterday, but I'm here and I'm ready to walk you through how much it cost to make a Sophie scarf. So before I really dive into the calculations, which I've got all figured out here, I want to preface it a little bit by talking through the formula I'm going to use and also acknowledging some of the limitations inherent in my approach. So, first of all, we need to calculate the cost of labor for knitting this item. And there's two ways that I'm going to do it. I'm going to walk you through the pricing structure as if I were accounting for the cost by an hourly rate, and then also an option by the yard. Now, when we get into the calculations of the cost of the labor when calculated by the yard, there is an inherent issue here because I used fingering weight held double, whereas if I used a DK weight with a single strand, I would have used about half of the yardage. So there are some pitfalls when pricing this by the yard when I used fingering weight held double. I used 301.6 yards of fingering weight. If I had used DK weight, I would have used about 159 yards, assuming that the final product weighed the same, 65 grams. So there's some inherent issues with pricing it by the yard, but I wanted to provide both a breakdown with an hourly rate and a yardage rate. So just want to acknowledge that caveat first. But the general formula that I'm following is accounting for the cost of the labor, meaning the time or the yardage, and then also the cost of materials. I'll then be adding $1 for overhead, which is on the low end, and then multiplying that figure by 1.75. This gives about a 42 to 43% profit margin, and a profit margin is going to account for all of the added expenses. The cost of the pattern, the cost of my needles, the cost of my wool wash, of my blocking mats, all those things that I need that contribute to the cost of making this item. So with that said, let me go through the facts and the figures. So as I may have already established, I can't remember, but I spent 4 hours. No, I definitely established this. I spent 4 hours knitting this Sophie scarf. Technically, it's a little lower, less than 4 hours, but I haven't blocked it yet, and that's going to bring it past 4 hours. So just for ease, we're going to go with the figure of 4 hours for the time spent knitting. As far as materials go, I used 65 grams of fingering weight yarn. Assuming that a skein of fingering weight yarn is $30, then my cost of materials, there's some debate here. I could either say the cost of materials is $30 because I had to buy this skein, or skeins in my case. I bought 2 skeins, held them together. So I could account for that total cost. The high end would be $60 because I used 2 skeins to make this, even though I had 35 grams left over. So I could say $30 for 1 skein. I could make it with 1 skein. I could say $60 because I used 2 skeins. But I think just for ease, I'm going to calculate my cost of materials based on the grams used. So since this Sophie scarf is 65 grams, and assuming a standard skein of hand-dyed yarn that I'm using for this item is $30, then my cost of materials becomes $19.50. So let's do some calculations based on time spent with an hourly rate and yardage worked with a yardage rate or cost per yard. So I've decided to go through this with 6 different tiers, both for hourly rate and for yardage rate. And as I go through them, you might be thinking, what sounds good to you? What I don't know, seems fair in that 6-figure lineup. So let's start with an hourly rate. Let's say that I'm paying myself the federal minimum wage. Here in the United States, the current federal minimum wage and also the minimum wage for my state of Louisiana is $7.25. Ridiculous, but that's what it is. So if I were to charge myself an hourly rate of $7.25, then my cost is $29 for 4 hours of work. If I were to charge myself $10 an hour or pay myself $10 an hour, we're at $40 for cost, $15 an hour, $60 for cost of labor, $20 an hour, $80 for cost of labor, $25 an hour, $100 for cost of labor, and $30 an hour, $120 for cost of labor. This does not include cost of materials, does not include overhead, does not include profit margin. Just for my time, there's a range of $29 to $120. I also added a range, only 5 though for this. I went from 10 cents a yard to 30 cents a yard. And on the low end of the spectrum, at 10 cents a yard, the cost of my labor is $30.16. On the higher end of that scale, at 30 cents a yard, the cost of my labor is $90.48. Again, this doesn't account for cost of materials. It doesn't account for overhead or profit margin. So overall, that gives me a range from $29 to $90.48. Now, when I add cost of materials, and again, we're going with $19.50, the price starts to creep up. Now the range when going on an hourly rate starting at $7.25 per hour with the cost of materials, this gives us a price of $48.50. Now all the way on the other end of the spectrum where I'm paying myself $30 an hour plus the cost of materials, we now have $139.50. So that's quite a range, about $90 worth of difference. So a big range. Now, if I'm paying myself by the yard, at 10 cents a yard, we have $49.66. And then at 30 cents a yard on the other end of the spectrum, we're at $110.08. So as you may notice, there's quite a similarity between the lower end of each tier, paying myself minimum wage and paying myself only 10 cents a yard, bear similar results at $48.50 with minimum wage and $49.66 with 10 cents a yard. But we still need to add overhead. This adds $1 to each metric. So that's going to bring us anywhere from $49.50 to $111.08. But we also need a profit margin. This is really important because if you're pricing handmade, at least if you want to scale it and sell it repeatedly, you need to account for the additional costs outside of your labor and your materials. So I'm going to multiply these figures by 1.75. And like I said, this gives about a 42 to 43% profit margin. This covers additional expenses and unforeseen line items that you may be omitting when you're factoring in the cost of handmade. So if I am paying myself $7.25 an hour, the federal minimum wage, I've added $19.50 for the cost of materials, I've added $1 for overhead, and I've multiplied that figure by 1.75, giving me a 42 to 43% profit margin. My cost for a Sophie scarf is $86.63. If I go all the way up to $30 an hour, I add the cost of materials, I add the dollar for overhead, and I multiply that by 1.75, I come up with a cost of $245.88. That's quite a lot of money for a little neckerchief, but we continue. If we're going by the yard, starting at 10 cents a yard, I've added in cost of materials, overhead, and my profit margin. My baseline is $88.66. This again is very similar to the minimum wage rate, which was $86.63. However, when I go all the way up to 30 cents a yard, with profit margin, with overhead, with cost of materials, the final number for 30 cents a yard is $194.39. So we're at about a $50 difference between the high end based on hourly rate and based on yardage. And again, the yardage rate could change drastically if I were going based on a DK yardage number. So really, really interesting. So with all of those calculations, the cost of my labor, the cost of materials, and again, the cost of materials is on the low end because I think it would be fair to charge $30 for cost of materials because even though there are leftovers, if you have to purchase a skein of yarn to make the thing, you don't already have it, or I mean, even if you did already have it, you spent that money at some point. I think it's fair to charge $30, but just, for shock value, we'll go with the $19.50 figure. Now, there are some things to take into account when thinking about what tier I might want to select when setting my rate for this. I don't think that I need to charge $30 an hour for a Sophie scarf. This is a very simple design. This is not mindless knitting, but I don't have to lock in my big brain energy to complete this garment. I can take it on the go. I can knit while watching a movie. I could knit while having a conversation. I could do a lot of multitasking things. This does not require my full attention and full energy. It's very meditative, very quick knit. Now, if this were a more complicated item, for instance, if it had cables or if it had color work or if it was a very intricate design in some other way, then I would be more comfortable charging more per hour and or more per yard. However, because of the simplicity of this design, I'm comfortable having an hourly rate of around $10 to $15 and a yardage rate, if I were to go with that, in the mid-range of that 5-tiered scale. So all this to say, I could crunch numbers on this all day long, but ultimately when you're pricing a handmade item, you need to go with a figure that feels right to you, that feels like you're honoring your time, that it's worth your time, and that you're not shortchanging yourself. So when I'm personally thinking of how to price this, I don't think that I would personally take a commission for a Sophie scarf less than $75. In fact, I think $85, $90, even $100 is well within a fair window. So if I'm going from a $75 to $100 range, let's break down what I would be paying myself either hourly or by the yard, accounting again for cost of materials, for overhead, and for a profit margin. I would either be paying myself minimum wage, $7.25, or I would be paying myself 10 cents a yard. Both of those figures bring me to something sub $90. This is extremely low and interesting, adds an interesting perspective to the conversation because I don't really think $7.25 is a fair rate for much of anything. And especially considering the fact that I have been knitting for over 15 years, right? Yes, 16 years. That's nuts. Do you feel like if you've been in a field, whatever it may be, for 16 years, that you shouldn't have had a pay raise in that time? That you should still be making minimum wage? I don't think so. I don't really think anyone should be making minimum wage anyway. I think that's a problem that needs to be solved. That's a whole different conversation. But to pay myself $7.25 for something, a craft that I've worked on for almost 2 decades, gearing up to be 2 decades in a few years, that seems a little absurd. So I just don't know about that. I just don't know. However, when I'm thinking about the reality of this teensy weensy, itty bitty neckerchief, I just can't fathom the idea of charging more than $100. But if I were to pay myself, let's go as high as $15 an hour, that brings the price to $140. So interesting. I think this is a great peeling back the curtain to look into the cost of handmade, because even something so small as a Sophie scarf still has considerable cost associated with it. And let's say you're not doing this professionally. You're not trying to make a quick buck. I mean, not a quick buck, just a buck, a slow buck, if we're being honest. Anyway, let's say you just want to have your time compensated. Someone bought the yarn. We've all had this happen where someone says, will you make this for me if I buy the yarn? And most of the time it's like, absolutely not, get away from me. But sometimes it's a special person and you're like, I would do that for you. So let's say you just want your time compensated. So we're not accounting cost of materials. We're not accounting any profit margin or overhead. Then if I'm paying myself $15 an hour, this is a $60 scarf. If I'm paying myself $20 an hour, this is an $80 scarf. So, you know, that's still a substantial amount of money. So I think ultimately the takeaway is the skill of knitting really is priceless. It really is. But anyway, that's how much it cost me to knit this Sophie scarf. Just out of curiosity, I asked last night on Instagram what you would charge, and I got some very interesting responses. Some people said as low as $50. I got a lot in the $75 to $100 range, with some people even saying up to $200 or $300. So I fully support that. And, you know, there's lots of other factors that may go into how much a hand knit costs. What is the fiber you're using? Are you using a more luxurious blend? Are you using cashmere, silk, yak? That might make the cost of materials go up, which will influence the overall cost of the item. But there you go. I thought this was really, really interesting, and I'm eager to continue looking at the cost of handmade. I think next I'm going to make a classic ribbed hat, maybe? We'll see. Let me know in the comments what item you'd like to see me do this same process with, time myself, calculate the yardage, and then see what the true cost of handmade is. I'd also love for you to let me know in the comments what you would charge for a Sophie scarf, or if you have charged for a Sophie scarf or a similar handmade item, what your rate was. Was it well received? How did you feel about it? Did you feel good, confident, or did you feel shy and, I don't know, embarrassed? Pricing handmade is so difficult, and it's really a personal endeavor. You just have to do what makes it worth it for you if you're going to be selling your handmade items. And if someone sent you this video because you are not a maker and you asked them to make something for you, I hope you learned something. And maybe you should consider taking up knitting, because it is so rewarding, and you won't save money, but you won't have to outsource $200 for a little neckerchief. Anyway, that's all for today's video. Thanks so much for coming along with me as I figured out the true cost of handmade, the Sophie Scarf edition. I hope that you'll stick around for my other videos. I have weekly podcasts and I go on knitting tours routinely. I've got a lot next year that I'm really excited to take you along for the ride. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future content. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.